Oh shit, my mic is still on. We're just gonna forget that I forgot to turn my mic off before stream started. Yeah. I thought I could fit one more game of Sky Battle in before stream started, and I technically did. I did start stream at 8, but I died right. Like, I died in Sky Battle, and then I checked the time, and I was like, shit, I need to start stream. I'm doing well, Unknown. I've had a cold for the past week and a half, but I finally felt well enough and had enough time to stream a bit more frequently, although it's only going to be for the next month or so before second semester of college starts back up. 'Cause yeah, it's really only like when I wake up in the mornings I just have a dry throat, and that's normally fixed with a swig of water, and then good luck. And then at night it's like when my voice has run a bit like weary from talking all day, I just get a whooping cough, and then like a little bit of a stuffy nose in the morning, but that's about it. It was so much worse when I got sick, and I had to do a Christmas concert, a choral Christmas concert. It was for my choir, and I couldn't sing. I mean, I sung from time to time, but like I mostly kept my voice like. I was a bit sad because I couldn't sing the whole time. Especially since some of the songs were like really fun. Like there was a spiritual version of Go Where I Send Thee. I don't know if you know that song, but it's like, I'm gonna send thee one by one, one for the little bitty baby. Something like that. Anyway. Yeah, it's such a cool song. And I did sing a little bit towards the end, but my throat was in absolute shambles at the end of the day. I like Ricola cough drops and Alka-Seltzer tablets were my best friend. Like, I kid you not, those things work wonders. Alright, now, for today's stream, I've been wanting to do this forever. Like, it's been like a couple weeks since reading chapter 20 of The Stars and Their Children, and I've been waiting I've been so excited to read the next couple chapters, but then I got sick. Again. So, couldn't exactly talk, let alone stream. But today, we're going to be reading chapter 21. Alright. And as always, the sub goal is still to play Omori, because I've heard that it's a really good game, and I want to play it, but I want to make sure I'm financially stable enough to buy it, so I made it a sub goal. So that way I'd have the money to actually pay for it. Maybe not immediately. I don't know how Twitch payouts work, but we'll see. Also, if you hear random, like, outside noises, that's because my window's open. I didn't bring my fan down with me from college, even though I didn't actually need it. And my room is directly underneath the attic, so it is warm all times of the year in my room if I don't have some kind of cooling. And so my window is open. Also, just to make sure I don't actually, like, ruin my voice by the end of the night, I'm going to be taking constant drink breaks. Let's do this. Alright. As always, The Stars and Their Children is written by Bones and the Bees. Such a talented author. I highly recommend checking out her other works. We read a couple of them on stream in the past, such as Tommy and Its Clinic for Supervillains, Under the Brine, and Nocturnal Animals. Those were the 3 of hers that I read before this one. I think those were all of them written by her. Yeah. Alright. In the last chapter, it was just after Wilbur and Tommy's big argument, where Tommy called him a bastard, and so now they're not really speaking to each other anymore. Wilbur had a panic attack in Phil's room. Wilbur got put in a new room. Something like that. Chapter 21. Judging Eyes Cast His Way. Summary. Not everyone is happy about Wilbur's new living situation. Okay. Any trigger warnings? Nope, I think we are good. The next day, Wilbur found himself wandering. He was still getting used to the fact that he was staying in the personal wing, and essentially had free reign of the place. The night before, he'd struggled to fall asleep. His room had been too silent without Tommy's soft breaths to accompany his own, and he tossed and turned until he grew so tired he hadn't even realized he'd fallen asleep until he woke up. Today, Wilbur was tired. The bags under his eyes were darker than usual, and his thoughts kept drifting aimlessly from topic to topic. An ache still lingered in his chest, spreading through his limbs and weighing down his heart every time he thought about Tommy. The water was still covering his head, but he wasn't drowning in it. He could breathe. It was just a bit more difficult than before. It was getting more manageable with each passing day. That didn't mean it was okay. This morning over breakfast, Phil read Wilbur more from his text on Elytra. Unlike the day before, though, Wilbur didn't rest his head on the table, despite how badly he wanted to. He forced his shoulders straight, and tried to eat what he could, although he still only ate about half his food. His eyes were heavy, but he kept them open through sheer force of will. Phil seemed to notice his exhaustion, but hadn't commented on it. He just read. Read without waiting for Wilbur to ask. Read without the exception of any conversation. And Wilbur was so unbelievably grateful for that weight to not be on his shoulders, because he couldn't carry anything else. Not anymore. I don't know if you could tell. Gee, it's a bit difficult for me to, speak lower, I guess, because, I don't know. Maybe it's because of the fact that I'm still a little bit on the mend, you know? After breakfast, Phil had left the dining room, citing that he had work to attend to, but Wilbur was welcome to come find him if he needed anything. So now, Wilbur found himself wandering without a purpose. If he stayed in his room, he was going to drive himself nuts staring at the wall. But if he left the personal wing, he was running the risk of bumping into Tommy, which was something he knew he wouldn't be able to handle right now. Jack followed behind him as Wilbur walked along the halls, avoiding eye contact with the other guards and letting his gaze trail along the glittering cityscape that sat outside the windows. His footsteps echoed off the walls, bouncing down the corridor like discordant music. He tried to ignore the gaping hole in his chest, the one that let frigid wind pass straight through him and made him feel as though his blood was pouring out of his chest in time with the waves crashing above his head. If he let his mind wander further than his legs, he could almost hear the saltwater blood dripping from his fingertips and onto the floor beneath him. A beat of his heart. Thump. A droplet of water. Drip. Thump. Drip. Thump. Drip. He turned a corner, and pink flashed in his peripheral vision. Thump. Orpheus? Drip. Shit. Stopping in his tracks, Wilbur grit his teeth and had to force himself to turn around to face a man he really did not want to see right now. Technoblade? Wilbur greeted, dipping his head with a wince. Silence hung between them, thick and twisted as it coiled around Wilbur's throat. The last time he'd seen the Imperator, he'd told Wilbur the very thing that decimated the little stability he had left. That Tommy was moving forward with the discussions without consulting him. That Tommy had betrayed him. The last time he'd seen the Imperator, Wilbur had run out of the library with Technoblade calling after him. Now, he desperately wanted to repeat the past. He wanted to run, to get far away from Technoblade and avoid whatever new, terrible thing he could tell Wilbur about his brother. But he forced himself to stand his ground and meet Technoblade's eyes. Another beat passed. Then, you're in the personal wing. It wasn't a question, and Technoblade didn't seem very surprised, but he still looked like he was taken aback seeing Wilbur here. Yes, I am. Did Phil not tell you? Wilbur asked, furrowing his brows. Technoblade blinked. Yeah, he did. I just wasn't expecting to run into you. Wilbur forced his face to remain impassive as he shrugged. I was just walking around. As far as I'm aware, I'm allowed to explore. Oh yeah, you are. Technoblade nodded. He paused then, a frown flashing over his face as he seemed to struggle to figure out what to say. Look, the last time we talked, things didn't end very well, to say the least. Folding his arms over his chest, Wilbur took a step back, his shoulder brushing against Jack's. A small measure of relief washed over him at the reminder that his friend was here, and he forced himself to take another steadying breath. I presume that He cut himself off, flinching when he went to say Tommy's name. I presume you were told about what happened? It was vague, but he knew Technoblade would know what he was talking about. It was easier than putting the reality into words. Keeping it vague meant he didn't have to choose whether to call his brother Tommy or Theseus in front of Technoblade, because that choice would tell Technoblade far more about the situation than he wanted the man to know. Technoblade raised an eyebrow. Yeah, I know what happened, he said after another beat, deciding not to comment on Wilbur's near slip-up. You and your brother got into a pretty nasty fight. That's one way to put it, Wilbur muttered, thinking that nasty wasn't an apt descriptor for what happened at all. It wasn't nasty how Tommy cut his heart out with his words. It was so much more than nasty. It was cruel. It was blinding. It was like Wilbur's entire world had ended right then and there. A moment passed. Technoblade didn't say anything in response to that, and silence choked the air once again. Despite how badly Wilbur wanted to hold his ground and not give Technoblade any room between them, he found questions burning in the forefront of his mind. Because Technoblade was close with Tommy. Horribly close. That's how he'd wormed his way into Tommy's head in the first place. He had to know more than he was saying, and Wilbur wanted to know what Tommy had told him. Wilbur had no idea what was happening with Tommy right now. He didn't know if his final blow had cut his brother as deeply as he wanted it to, and he didn't know if Tommy even cared that they were separated. The angry part of him wanted to imagine Tommy as this vindictive, cruel boy, Prince Theseus, who landed the final blow on Wilbur's pillar that sent him crumbling beneath the waves, and didn't care in the slightest that the two were staying in separate rooms now. Who probably was glad to be rid of his insufferable asshole of an older brother. But that wasn't Tommy. Wilbur knew that. He couldn't even delude himself into thinking it, despite how upset he was. Tommy wasn't vindictive or cruel. He was probably taking things just as hard as Wilbur was. But for the first time in his life, he couldn't just go find him to see for himself how he was doing. His feet wouldn't carry him out of the personal wing, because he was too scared of what he might find waiting for him outside those doors. So that's where Technoblade came in. A middleman Wilbur could use to gauge how Tommy was handling all of this, because the ache in Wilbur's chest demanded answers. How is he doing? Wilbur whispered, eyes dropping to the floor. Tommy? Technoblade asked. Wilbur nodded, and there was a pause. 1 second passed, then another. Do you want my honest opinion? Wilbur nodded again. He tried to brace himself for whatever Technoblade was about to tell him. He's angry, Technoblade told him. And I don't mean angry in the way where he's all puffed up and pissy and gets over it in a few hours. It's more than that. Gritting his teeth, Wilbur tried not to let any hurt flash over his face. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But I'd argue I have more of a right to be angry at him than he is at me. At this, Technoblade frowned. Oh, I didn't mean he was angry at you. Eyes going wide, Wilbur froze. What? Well, he is angry at you, but he's also angry at just about everything, from what I can tell. Technoblade explained, folding his arms over his chest. "He nearly bit my head off when I went to check on him the night of your fight, and I'm pretty sure I heard him snapping a Rambo earlier today too." Oh. Wilbur knew what that was. When Tommy was upset, really upset, he'd bite any hand that came near him. He'd stew in his own frustration, refusing help from anyone around him until he ran out of steam. And in the past, Wilbur had found that in situations like those, Tommy wasn't actually pissed at everyone else. When he was swallowed up by his own frustration like that, it was most often because he was angry at himself. Was that what Tommy was going through right now? Was he angry at himself for what he said to Wilbur? That could be it. But then Wilbur heard "bastard" echo in his head again, and he found himself second-guessing himself as soon as that thought had formed. Because Tommy had wanted to hurt Wilbur. He could see it in his eyes. The blow was supposed to make Wilbur bleed, and now Wilbur's hands felt as though they were soaked in his own blood. His words had landed. It was very possible Tommy didn't regret what he'd said at all. Once upon a time, Wilbur would have been able to say for sure which one it was, because once upon a time, he knew Tommy better than Tommy knew himself. But that wasn't true anymore. The boy who had called Wilbur a bastard didn't look like his Tommy. He didn't know that boy, and that boy didn't know him. So the answers he wanted were out of his reach. "Are you gonna try talking to him anytime soon?" Technoblade then asked, startling Wilbur out of his thoughts. Even if other answers were impossible for Wilbur to find, he knew the answer to that one without thinking. "No," he snapped, narrowing his eyes at the Imperator and daring him to argue. Back on Eldingbeger, there wouldn't have been a question about what Wilbur was supposed to do now. Errett would have pulled him aside, telling him in a gentle but firm voice that as the older one, it was his responsibility to apologize first, and there was no option where he could refuse. Technoblade blinked. "All right then, up to you, I suppose." Oh, that was unexpected. With that, Technoblade turned on his heel and walked down the hallway from Wilbur and Jack. Wilbur stared at the pink braid that swung across his back, his brain short-circuiting as he tried to figure out what just happened. "Oh wait, hold on, 1 second. Time to be real. Hold on." Smile chat. Hold on. Okay, I don't have much time. I'm taking it now. Gotta check something else on my phone. Okay. I'm gonna take this time to drink more water. I'm gonna need to fill this up at some point. All right. There was no scolding. There was no reminder that he needed to be the bigger person. Just acceptance. But then again, why did Wilbur expect Technoblade to scold him? It wasn't like he had any real authority over this and Tommy's interactions. An imperator couldn't order two foreign princes to get along with each other. This was between him and Tommy. Technoblade turned a corner and disappeared from sight completely. And Wilbur found himself wondering if Tommy was going to ask Technoblade the same thing Wilbur asked him, how he was doing. If he did, what would Technoblade say? Would he describe him as being angry, like he described Tommy? Or did Technoblade see his tight voice and clenched jaw as signs of being distressed? Would Technoblade tell Tommy about the bags under his eyes? Or would he leave that part out? Wilbur didn't know. And that was almost to be expected at this point with Technoblade. Wilbur didn't understand the Imperator in the slightest. Not his motives, not his questions, none of it. After staring down the empty hallway for another few beats, Wilbur turned around and headed back towards his room. Jack followed him without a word. Despite the anxiety twisting Wilbur's gut with each passing minute, each passing hour, each passing day that he went without speaking to Tommy, he found that there was one thing overriding all his fear and grief and pain about their argument. One thing that dominated his mind and settled over his shoulders with a near suffocating weight. Boredom. Wilbur was bored. The personal wing was much smaller than the main palace, and after his run-in with Technoblade, he was far less inclined to wander around it aimlessly. He considered going to speak to Phil to have something to do, but it wasn't like he could just bother Phil for no reason at all. He still had an empire to run after all, and Wilbur didn't want to annoy him. Not when he'd already been so kind to Wilbur the past few days. So Wilbur tried to ignore the boredom. He got a holopad of his own to read books on, and lingered in his room, poring over texts from Elytra. And it helped, but it wasn't enough. There's still an itch under his skin, an ache clawing inside his chest, demanding that he get up and do something so he could get it all to shut up. There was a small voice in his head that kept wondering what Tommy was doing right now. If he was okay, if he was upset, if he was angry, if he was happy. Was he sleeping? Wilbur certainly wasn't. Hold on, what's this? Oh. Hold on a moment. Hold on. Anyway, there was a small voice in his head that kept wondering what Tommy was doing right now. If he was okay. Oh wait, no. I already read this paragraph. Eventually, the voice grew louder and louder and louder until it was drowning out all hope of him focusing on his reading. Wilbur needed to do something, anything to get out of his own head, even just for an hour or two. Which was how Wilbur found himself stepping outside of the personal wing with a pounding heart and anxiety bubbling away inside of him. He didn't want to run into Tommy. That was something Wilbur was certain of. He wasn't sure if he could handle it yet, and the edges of his wounds were still so jagged and raw. If he saw Tommy, he really had no clue how he'd react, but he knew it wouldn't be pretty. The doors hissed as they slid shut behind him. Jack was at his side, back straight and gaze fixed ahead, but Wilbur could tell there was a hint of worry in the lines of his forehead. And he couldn't blame Jack. After all, the last time he'd spoken to Tommy, it had ended with him having one of the worst panic attacks he'd ever had in his life. For a moment, he debated turning tail and going back inside the personal wing, fleeing from a threat that might not even be there. But Wilbur forced himself to hold his ground. He wasn't scared of Tommy. It wasn't fair that he was confined to the personal wing while Tommy continued to have the rest of the palace to himself. Not when Tommy had used his tongue as a dagger. Not when Tommy had turned into a different person in front of Wilbur's very eyes. "Come on, Jack," Wilbur said, wincing at how tight his voice was. "Let's go to the library." Jack blinked before stumbling along down the hall, struggling to keep pace with Wilbur's longer legs. "Oh, shit, okay. You sure you want to go there, though?" Wilbur kept walking, but turned to raise an eyebrow at Jack. "Why wouldn't I? I mean, it's close to your old room," Jack pointed out, brows furrowing. The warning was clear. If they went to the library, there was a higher chance of them running into Tommy. Wilbur forced his legs to keep moving. "It's fine," Wilbur lied. "The beat." "Okay then," Jack then said, and kept walking beside him. They made their way down the twisting halls of the palace, Wilbur trying not to feel like his skin was prickling under some invisible gaze. Every time they turned a corner, his heart skipped a beat. If they heard footsteps echoing behind them, his breathing hitched. And when a door opened right along the hall, with a familiar figure rushing out, Wilbur had to bite back a yelp. At least until he realized who it was, and relief washed over him because it wasn't him. "Oh shit," Quackity said, freezing halfway out of the room when he was leaving. "I haven't seen you in a while, Orpheus." Tension bled out of Wilbur's shoulders as he took a breath to steady himself. It was just Quackity. Wilbur could handle talking to Quackity. "Yeah, it's been a while." Oh, that yawn came out of nowhere, sorry. Wilbur agreed, trying not to wince when he realized that the last time they'd properly spoken was when he'd gotten drunk off his ass in Quackity's room. By the way, I'm sorry about all the..." He trailed off, making a vague hand gesture to refer to his night of weakness. Quackity's eyes lit up with understanding, and he nodded. "I get it, man. You definitely seem to be going through some shit." He paused, gaze flickering to Wilbur's coat, before trailing back up to his face. "Honestly, you still kinda seem to be going through some shit." Wilbur huffed out a humorless laugh. That's one way to put it. Narrowing his eyes, Quackity fully stepped out into the hallway so he was face to face with Wilbur. "You know, I'm just taking a wild guess here, but does the reason you look like you're 2 seconds away from passing out have anything to do with the fact that that your little brother also looks like shit? Shit. He does? Wilbur found himself asking, tripping over his own words. When did you see him? Have you talked to him? Whoa, hey, one question at a time. Quackity cut him off, holding his hands up in mock surrender. In case you forgot, I didn't really leave a great impression on Theseus after he saw me punch you that one time, so the two of us don't really talk. But I saw him in the dining hall this morning when he was getting breakfast, and the kid looks just as exhausted as you do. Wilbur clenched his jaw. But you didn't talk to him? Quackity shook his head. No, he had a Rambo, that kid Technoblade is mentoring with him. And also that Floor, who I always see hanging around him. The one with the beanie. He was most likely talking to those two. Rambo and Amesy. Of course. Wilbur wouldn't be surprised if they were barely leaving Tommy's side in the wake of all this. Something happened between you two, Quackity said, completely blunt and to the point. There was no question there. It was just a statement of a fact. That's none of your business. Wilbur snapped without thinking. Quackity raised an eyebrow, and it tugged on his scar. Look, it's not like I care about whatever drama you have going on with your kid brother, but you don't get to pull the "it's not your business" card when you spent several hours drunk off your ass going on and on about how you think you're a shitty sibling and wished things were better between you two. Well, Quackity had a point there. I said I was sorry for that, alright? Wilbur hissed, glaring at Quackity. If you must know, yes, we got into a fight. Congrats on figuring that one out. You're a real fucking genius, Quackity. You can bitch at me all you want, Orpheus. I'm just asking a simple question. Quackity snapped, scowling at him. So is that why you've been totally off the radar these past few days? Because you're hiding from Theseus? Wilbur winced. I've been staying in another part of the palace. At this, Quackity hesitated. His scowl faded, and his good eye fell down to the embroidered stars trailing up Wilbur's coat. He blinked a few times, as if he was turning over different possibilities in his mind. Wilbur had to resist the urge to squirm under his scrutiny. Where are you staying? He asked after a minute, something cautious in his tone. The personal wing, Wilbur told him, folding his arms over his chest. The part of the palace where Phil and Techno take their meals and the like. And just like that, all the anger dissipated from Quackity's face completely. His good eye went wide and his eyebrows shot up to his hairline. He took a step back from Wilbur, looking him completely up and down as if he was just now seeing him for the first time. Along his arms, the tattooed feathers rustled, as if they were just as troubled as Quackity himself seemed to be. You're staying in the personal wing? Like, you have your own room and everything? Wilbur frowned, wondering if he'd said something he shouldn't have. Yes, I do. It just makes things easier so I can avoid running into... He hesitated. You know. Quackity's eyebrows dropped, and he nodded slowly, something in his face making it clear that he didn't believe that last part of what Wilbur said at all. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. He paused, opening his mouth like he was going to say something else, but before he could get a word out, there was a soft beeping coming from the golden earpiece that fanned around his ear. Shit, I gotta take this, Quackity muttered, frowning at the floor. I'll see you around, Orpheus. And before Wilbur could even muster out a goodbye, Quackity was turning on his heel and rushing off, tapping on his earpiece and greeting whoever was on the other end with a bellowing, "Hey, man!" Wilbur watched as Quackity disappeared around the corner. There was something odd about what had just happened. Quackity's reaction to finding out where Wilbur was staying wasn't what he'd been expecting. Yes, there were some strange implications to letting a foreign prince stay in the Emperor's personal part of the palace. Whether they were related to the negotiations, or if it was related to that other possibility, Wilbur wasn't exactly ready to think too deeply about. He knew the fact that he was staying in the personal wing meant something was going on. But those were only things Wilbur himself knew about. An outsider like Quackity couldn't pick up on anything like that, right? How would he? It didn't make sense. Am I missing something here? Wilbur asked Jack once Quackity's voice had faded down the hall. Like, I know that staying in the personal wing is strange, but it's not that unusual, right? Jack tensed. I mean, it's not exactly a common thing that happens here. Frowning, Wilbur debated asking him to explain what he meant by that. But then again, Wilbur knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't normal for an emperor to let a foreign prince stay in a personal wing. It wasn't normal for an emperor to calm a foreign prince down from a panic attack. And it certainly wasn't normal for an emperor to call a foreign prince by a nickname that his species usually reserved for their own children. Suddenly, there was the sound of several voices coming down the hall. Wilbur tensed, unable to pick out if Tommy's voice was one of them. Jack seemed to notice this too, and grabbed Wilbur's wrist to drag him into the empty meeting room that Quacky had just walked out of. The door went to slide shut behind them, and Wilbur held out a hand to stop it. Sensing the obstruction, the door stopped only a few inches from the edge of the doorframe. Then, Wilbur stepped back to make sure he was hidden next to the wall. He held a finger up to his lips so Jack knew to be quiet. The voices out in the hall got louder. Wilbur's heart picked up speed. I just don't get it, Ran. I thought Phil's had at least a little bit more political tact than this. Amesy. Wilbur immediately recognized their Floslium accent, and stiffened when they mentioned Phil's name. I don't really get it either, if I'm being honest, Rambu replied, and Wilbur listened to their footsteps slow down near the door he and Jack were hiding behind. Like, sure, I work with Techno a lot more than I work with Phil, but I still like to think I know Phil decently well. He's a smart guy. I never thought he'd be the guy to pull something this unexpected. Unexpected? Amesy snorted. Ranbu, it's blatant favoritism. He's letting Wilbur stay in his private wing of the palace with his own room, while Tommy is still staying in a guest room. And you said he's also letting Wilbur take meals with him, right? Wilbur jolted, hearing Amesy bring him up, and shared a wide-eyed look with Jack before focusing on the door again. That's what Techno told me, Rambu confirmed. But, in total fairness, from what I heard, Orpheus didn't ask to be put in the personal wing. Well, duh! You can't just ask for something like that, Amesy exclaimed. But Philza still gave it to him. And again, he's not stupid. There's a statement being made with that. He's keeping the Crown Prince to one of the wealthiest planets in the galaxy in a guest room, and while giving a non-heir a room in his personal quarters. I'm not good with, Amesy's accent, I'm sorry. I mean, it's not really a secret that he and Orpheus talk a lot. Rambu offered, sounding unsure. Also, you, didn't see how Tommy was doing until the next morning. But the fight was bad, Amesy. Really bad. Like, I get why Techno and Phil might take extreme measures to keep the two of them apart. Wilbur's breathing hitched. Jack shot him a worried look, which he purposefully ignored. Amesy was quiet for a beat. I offered to stay with him, Amesy then said, their voice much softer now. When he said he was going to try and take a nap, I asked if it might be easier if he had someone else in the room, since he's so used to Will being with him. But I think I just pissed him off with that. Rambu huffed at this. Yeah, I've learned quite a few Eldenvegrian curse words over the past few days. Oh yeah, he only breaks those out when he's really angry. Amesy snorted. Don't take it personally, though. He lashes out when he's really upset, but he doesn't mean it. I figured, Rambu muttered. I guess I'm just wondering what could have even happened to mess him up this badly. I know he and Orpheus have been arguing for a while now, but he won't tell me anything about what happened during that fight. I mean, what actually happened during their fight. He paused then, and Wilbur heard some shuffling footsteps, like Rambu was shifting from side to side. You've known both of them a lot longer than I have. Did you ever see anything happen like this on Eldingvegr? No, nothing close to it, Amesy told him. Honestly, ever since they got here, I've been wondering what happened, because they both act so differently from how I remember. Wilbur frowned at this, while Rambu made a questioning noise. How so? Just in the way they interact with each other. It's so cold, like they can barely tolerate each other. But that's not how they were on Eldingvegr. They were just so much warmer, constantly teasing each other or bickering, but not in a serious way, just a funny way. Or if Tommy was nervous or upset about something, he'd immediately grab Wilbur's hand. Neither of them would say anything, but you could tell it was always going to be the two of them and then everyone else. A lump formed in Wilbur's throat hearing Amesy talk about how he and Tommy used to be. He thought back to those days on Eldingvegr, when Amesy would hide from their junior diplomat duties by running off with Tommy and Tubbo, and the three of them would find Wilbur and Nikki and beg them to hide Amesy from the other Flora. And he remembered their group lounging in a sitting room, some political documentary playing on the wall that no one was paying attention to. Amesy and Nikki were chatting excitedly about something Wilbur couldn't hear. Tubbo had fallen asleep on the other end of the couch, and Tommy was curled into his side, teasing him about how long his hair had gotten and flicking his forehead as they tried to convince him to cut it. There was so much warmth in that memory. The pink sky outside their windows, Tommy's small body pressed against his side, Tubbo's soft snores, Nikki's bright smile, and Amesy's excited rambling. It was such a contrast to the icy water that was drowning all of them now. I think Tommy's been having nightmares, Rambu suddenly said, his voice low. What makes you say that? Amesy asked. Because last night I was walking by his room, and I heard someone shriek inside. It cut off really fast, and I almost knocked on the door to see if he was okay, but then he hesitated. I heard him crying, I think. The ache in Wilbur's chest was unbearable now. He grit his teeth, resting his forehead against the wall as he silently begged Amesy and Rombu to just fucking leave already. This is really hard on him, Amesy said softly. And I don't think Phil's blatant favoritism to Wilbur is really helping anything. When he told me what Techno had told him and about Wilbur staying in the personal wing, he definitely seemed upset about it. He definitely seemed upset about it. A pause. Does anyone else besides us know about this? About Wilbur staying in the personal wing? Rombu asked. There was a beat of silence, which Wilbur figured was Amesy nodding, because Rombu continued with, I don't know. Obviously the servants all know along with the guards, and I don't think it's necessarily supposed to be a secret or anything. I have to go to a meeting with the other florists soon, so I'm just wondering if anyone's going to bring it up, Amesy explained. It's not really our business, but the others will want to know how the state of the negotiations with Eldingvegger are going, since that directly affects our access to Blazafane. Are you going to tell them? Another pause. No, I don't think so. We don't really see a reason to. Wilbur breathed out a silent sigh of relief. Although there wasn't much he could do about it if Phil or Technoblade decided to spread the news, he'd rather things be kept quiet for the time being. Even if it did affect the negotiations later on, right now, this wasn't anyone else's business but theirs. I should probably start walking over to the meeting, Amesy said after a minute of silence. Oh, okay. Do you want me to walk you over there? Rombu offered. Sure, Ran, Amesy agreed, and Wilbur could hear the smile in their voice. Let's go. With that, their footsteps began to fade, and the roar in Wilbur's ears died down with it. Once they were gone, Wilbur found his chest aching with a newfound guilt. Tommy was upset. He'd known he was angry, but he was having nightmares. He was sure they had to do with their escape from Eldingvegger, because Wilbur had been having similar nightmares the past few nights. He hadn't woken up shrieking yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. When he was sure that Amesy and Rombu were far away, he rushed out of the unused meeting room, with Jack trailing right behind him. He took a few deep breaths, wincing as the cold air scraped against his throat. Leaning his forehead against the wall, Wilbur tried to count the waves in his mind, but there was no order to how they crashed. The fact that he was staying in the personal wing was upsetting Tommy. That shouldn't be surprising, but Wilbur had been so distracted thinking of all of the other things going on between the two of them that he hadn't even considered that as a possibility. Not to mention, the judgment in Amesy and Rombu's voices wasn't lost on him. Phil was making a statement by allowing Wilbur his own private room in the personal wing, while Tommy had to remain in his standard guest room. It was something the others were taking note of. It held meaning to it, and he couldn't help but wonder how the other leaders would look at him now if they were still here. Would they still see him as the bastard older brother of a crown prince? Would they see him as a failed advisor? Or would they see him as an extension of Phil? As something Phil had put a stake in? Implications. They swirled around Wilbur's head like fog, and he wondered how long it was going to take before he got lost in them. Shit. He needed to ask Phil about this. Let's go back, Wilbur told Jack, his words rough as he turned down the hallway back towards the personal wing. Jack made a surprised noise and rushed to keep up with him. What? I mean, yeah, that's fine, but are you... Pausing mid-step, Wilbur turned to meet Jack's eyes, waiting for him to ask. Because the answer was obvious. Are you okay? No. Wilbur hadn't been okay in days. They both knew that. Seeming to realize this, Jack shut his mouth. He stared at Wilbur for a moment, before nodding and taking the lead. And with a huff, Wilbur followed. They made it back to the personal wing without any more run-ins. As soon as the large doors had hissed shut behind them, Wilbur beelined down the familiar route to Phil's office, not even bothering to ask Jack if he was in there. His footsteps echoed off the walls, and in his mind he heard Ames's words play on loop. It's blatant favoritism. He definitely seemed upset about it. Even though Wilbur hadn't asked to stay in the personal wing, he couldn't help but feel like he was being blamed for it nonetheless. At least by Amesy and Rambu. But given how strange Quackity's reaction was to the whole thing, it was likely they weren't the only ones thinking that way. He reached Phil's door. Somehow, even when he wasn't sure what kind of answers he was looking for, he found himself seeking out the Emperor anyway. Taking a breath, Wilbur lifted his hand and knocked on the door. One beat passed. Then, the door slid open, and Wilbur met Phil's eyes through the doorway. He was sitting behind his desk, hunched over and feathers brushing the ground. When he saw Wilbur, though, he straightened up immediately. Orpheus? Phil? Wilbur greeted, dipping his head. Do you, have a minute? I know this is kind of sudden, but He hesitated, struggling to figure out the best way to phrase this. I have a question for you, if that's all right. For a moment, Phil was silent. Wilbur's heart began to race, and he wondered what the fuck he was doing. This conversation easily could have happened later. Since they were taking meals together, it would have been more appropriate to wait until dinner to ask him about the whole thing. And yet, Wilbur had found himself rushing to Phil's office the second that guilty ache made itself known. Like he knew the only way to quiet the waves crashing above his head was to find Phil, because somehow, Phil always seemed to know exactly what to say to soothe the waters of his mind. Of course that's all right, Phil said after his pause, straightening up in his seat and gesturing for Wilbur to come inside. Come, take a seat. He gave Jack a small nod, and Jack nodded back as he settled himself outside the door. Then, Wilbur stepped into the office, and the door slid shut behind him with a soft whoosh. Somehow, Phil's office was even messier than it had been the last time Wilbur had seen it. Or, well, the last time he remembered getting a good look at it. When he was in the office a few days prior, he hadn't exactly been paying attention to how it looked. He was a bit too focused on everything else. His eyes skimmed over the part of the wall he'd punched during his breakdown. The stone itself was unmarked, but his wrapped hand throbbed with a phantom ache. Phil's desk was absolutely covered in stacks of papers and random knickknacks. He averted his eyes from the words on the pages, not wanting to accidentally read anything he wasn't supposed to. But Phil didn't seem worried about him seeing something he shouldn't. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, brushing his hair back from his face and stretching his wings out behind him with a quiet groan. Wilbur stared at the chair that sat on the other side of Phil's desk. It felt odd to sit down across the desk from him now, as if this was some kind of formal meeting, when Wilbur just wanted to ask him a simple question. He glanced between the chair, the desk, and Phil's chair. His brows furrowed. Before he could talk himself out of it, Wilbur grabbed the chair that sat on the other side of the desk and dragged it around so it was only a few feet from Phil's own chair. Phil raised his eyebrows in surprise, but didn't say anything as Wilbur sat down, heart pounding out of his chest. A moment of silence passed. He waited for Phil to comment on his choice of seat. He didn't. "What's going on, mate?" Phil asked instead, turning to face him like there was nothing unusual about this whole situation. Wilbur opened his mouth, trying to figure out how to put his racing thoughts into words. The guilt hadn't lessened since he'd stepped inside the office, and the fact that Phil hadn't said a single thing to Wilbur moving his chair next to his actually made it worse, because it was a reminder that what Amesy said wasn't wrong at all. Phil was favoring him. He was favoring him, and it was hurting Tommy as a result. And Wilbur wished he could just say he didn't care, because Tommy had hurt him, so he shouldn't care about hurting him back. But he couldn't stop. Worrying about Tommy was something he'd done nonstop for the past 15 years. It wasn't something he could just shut off. "You're playing favorites," Wilbur finally said after nearly 2 minutes of silence. "Between me and him. You're playing favorites and people are noticing." Phil blinked. "I'm playing favorites with you and Theseus?" Wilbur nodded. Phil considered this for a moment before humming. "I suppose you could say I am." "What? That's it?" Wilbur asked, frowning at him. "You're not going to try and deny it?" "Obvious. It's not exactly a secret that I'm closer with you than I am with your brother, especially since you and I have talked far more than I have with him," Phil said, seeming confused by Wilbur's reaction. "It's not like I'm purposefully trying to snub Theseus by granting you a room in this part of the palace and not him, but I'm not going to pretend like I would have given him the same room had I run into him first after your fight instead of you." "But he's the crown prince. Don't you see what kind of statement you're making with this?" Wilbur asked, his voice rising in volume. "Others are noticing, Phil. I overheard Rombu and Amesy talking about it, and they both don't understand why you're showing me, a non-heir, such blatant favoritism." Leaning further back in his seat, Phil turned it over in his mind, tapping his talons against the arm of his chair. "Okay." "Huh?" "Okay, that's it?" Wilbur pushed. "You're not worried?" "Why would I be worried?" Phil asked, raising an eyebrow. "I know my people. This isn't something they're going to lose their heads over. Sure, it might give me a few raised eyebrows, but frankly I don't give a shit what the others think." Dragging his hands down his face, Wilbur bit back the urge to ask about the negotiations, because a part of him knew Phil was right. He didn't have to worry about his own people's judgment for showing favoritism to the non-heir of a foreign planet, but he did have to worry about Tommy's thoughts on the matter, because Tommy was the one in charge of the negotiations, and pissing him off wasn't exactly in his best interest. But isn't that what Wilbur wanted? He wanted to keep Eldingvegr from falling under Antarctic control. His entire fight with Tommy was sparked by the fact that he was talking to Technoblade about joining the Empire. It was a good thing for Tommy to be upset with Phil in this situation, right? Wilbur didn't know anymore. His thoughts were spinning again, and his head was throbbing something fierce. He was a mess of conflicted thoughts and feelings. He didn't want to think about this right now. Not about the fact that he felt like he was standing at the bottom of an avalanche, watching the torrential downpour of ice approach with no way to escape. He took a shuddering breath and hunched over. Suddenly, there was a hand on his shoulder, and he found himself leaning closer to the singular source of warmth in the icy room. He gets so stressed so easily sometimes, Phil teased, rubbing small circles into his shoulder blade with his thumb. If you had wings, I bet your feathers would be ruffled all the time, little bird. Oh. You think so? Wilbur asked, keeping his eyes shut as the ache in his chest began to fade. I do, Phil hummed, moving his hand to the back of Wilbur's neck. Wilbur took another deep breath, letting Phil's words settle the waves in his head like dropping oil onto its troubled seas. What would they be like? Wilbur then asked, his voice low. If I had wings, what do you think they'd be like? He wasn't sure where the question came from. It slipped out without his permission, but it was the only thing he could think of right now as Phil continued to rub small circles onto the back of his neck. For a moment, Phil didn't respond. Wilbur's eyes fluttered open, and he saw that the man's brows were furrowed as he stared at the wall above his head. Then, he'd be the type of elytrian to have very expressive wings, I think, Phil began, not meeting Wilbur's eyes. I don't mean this as an insult, but you're not the best at keeping a poker face. Your wings would only make it worse. If you were upset, they'd bristle immediately. Or if you were pissed off, they'd puff up, even if you took them close to your back to try and hide it. Wilbur tried to imagine it. Tried to imagine having wings that could span the length of an entire room. Feathers that would betray his feelings just as easily as his face. He wondered what color they'd be. Although Phil was the only elytrian he'd seen, he knew avian plumage varied widely, and since avians were descendants of elytrians, it only made sense they had far more feather colors than just the pitch black that Phil's were. I suppose it's probably better this way, Wilbur huffed. You said it yourself. I already have a hard time enough hiding my emotions on my face. Adding wings would make me an open book to anyone who looked at me. I wouldn't worry too much about that. You're still young, little bird. You'll get better at that sort of thing with time. Blinking, Wilbur glanced up again and found himself meeting Phil's eyes. And if I had wings, would I learn how to control those with time as well? For the briefest moment, Wilbur could have sworn he saw a smile flash over Wilbur's face. You would, because I'd teach you how. There was a pause. Phil blinked. The warmth on his face faded, and he pulled his hand away, feathers rustling as he tucked his wings into his back. Wilbur frowned at the sudden loss of contact, straightening up in his seat as Phil turned his head away, looking back down at the papers on his desk. I'm sorry, Orpheus, but if that's all you need for now, I do have some work I need to get back to, Phil then said, his voice strangely tight. Oh. Shit, yeah. Wilbur had just barged into his office without any warning this time. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. No, you don't need to apologize, Phil reassured him, glancing up as Wilbur pushed out of his chair. You did nothing wrong. Wilbur nodded, deciding to trust that Phil wasn't bullshitting him, because a lot of their conversations had been built on the idea that Phil was more honest with Orpheus than others would be. If Phil didn't want him in here, he could have turned him away at the door. I heard something. Was it my cat scratching against the door? 1 second. It might have just been the trees. Now that I think about it, there's trees right outside my window. Where are my headphones? Let's see. Wait, never mind. Still, it was odd how suddenly he was being rushed out, almost like a switch had been flipped. I'll see what did it then, I suppose, Wilbur asked, hovering in the doorway. I might take my dinner in here. I just have a lot of paperwork to catch up on, Phil said, head tilted down again. For some reason, there was a stab of disappointment in Wilbur's chest hearing that. Okay. Good night then, Phil. With a final wave, Wilbur left the room before Phil could say his own goodbye. The pain in his chest was still there, but it had been soothed by Phil's comforting words. Despite their rushed goodbye, he could still feel the warmth left from Phil's hand on the back of his neck, almost like a brand. It was both comforting and not at the same time. Back in the hallway, Jack jumped to attention. He raised an eyebrow in silent question, and Wilbur gave him a small nod, a reassurance that he was all right. Outside the windows that lined the halls, the capital city of Zephyr's Fork glittered in the light of the blue and white ice that surrounded it. His eyes trailed along the carved metal buildings and the high-tech trains that flew between them like birds. His back twinged, and he thought about the way that Phil spoke about the wings he would have if he were in a light train. How they would reflect his emotions as openly as his face did. It was certainly a good thing he didn't have wings for that reason alone, but at the same time, Wilbur found himself eyeing the arched ceiling of the ice cavern outside, and wondering what it would be like to fly up to it. So caught up in his own thoughts, Wilbur was barely paying attention to his surroundings as they made their way back to his room. They paused by the training room, and Wilbur would have walked by it without a second glance if the doors hadn't opened the second they passed by. He startled at the loud hiss, freezing mid-step. A figure hurried out of the training room, towels slung over his shoulders and sweat dripping from his forehead. A rock dropped into Wilbur's gut when he locked eyes with Tommy for the first time since their fight. The second Tommy saw him, he stopped walking. His face was unreadable, but Wilbur didn't miss the way his eyes darted over Wilbur's new coat, before lingering on his bandaged hand. The last time Wilbur had seen those eyes, they were sparking with icy flames, until they weren't. Until they were ice cold and completely unfamiliar as he hissed out an insult Wilbur had never thought he'd hear from his brother's mouth. This time, Wilbur didn't stop long enough to see if the ice was still there, because he couldn't let himself linger for that long. Seeing Tommy was enough to knock the wind out of his chest, and his body went on autopilot as his etiquette training took over once again. There was an iron band wrapping around his chest as he straightened his shoulders, keeping his head held high as he turned on his heel and walked back towards his room. His legs were stiff, and he couldn't hear a single thing around him because of the deafening waves in his head. But he kept walking. And walking. And walking. All while ignoring the stare of burning holes into the back of his head. Right before he turned the corner, though, he risked a glance back to see if Tommy was still watching him from the front of the training room. To Wilbur's surprise, Tommy was nowhere to be seen. So when the door to his room shut behind him, he was alone once again. Good chapter. Good chapter. Well, let's go back to the top to see how many chapters I need to catch up on. 2 more. Awesome. Okay. I think that is going to be my stream. This was such a good chapter. It hasn't felt like an hour and 20 minutes, but... And I'm glad that, like, halfway through reading, my voice felt back to normal. That felt nice. I'm sure it's gonna bite me in the ass later, but we'll see. Maybe if I keep drinking water and just drink a shit ton of tea as well, maybe I'll be fine. We'll see. I think it is time to raid somebody. Let's raid. Did I spell it right? Yeah. We're gonna be raiding Fiery Alex. He's playing Breath of the Wild. Wait, is it Breath of the Wild? It's a Zelda game of some kind. Okay, it is Breath of the Wild. I mean, it's only one viewer, and that viewer is me. Should I? No, I'm gonna do it anyway. Alright. Thank y'all so much for watching. Be sure to follow me on my other socials. Let me just... Boop. There you go. You click on the link tree and it'll bring you to my other socials. And yeah. I'm not sure what my next stream is gonna be. But we'll see. Alright. I'll see y'all next time. Bye!